Students attend a Baptist campus ministry service at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green. Brittany Greason, Reuters. Last week, the University of Chicago's Dean of Students sent a welcome letter to freshmen decrying trigger warnings in safe spaces, ways for students to be warned about and opt out of exposure to potentially challenging material. While some supported the school's actions, arguing that these practices threaten free speech and the purpose of higher education, the note also led to widespread outrage, and understandably so. Considered in isolation, trigger warnings may seem straightforwardly good. Basic human decency means professors like myself should be aware of students' traumatic experiences, and give them a heads up about coarse content, photographs of dead bodies, extended accounts of abuse, disordered eating, self-harm, that might trigger an anxiety attack and foreclose intellectual engagement. Similarly, it may seem silly to object to the creation of safe spaces on campus, where members of marginalized groups can count on meeting supportive conversation partners who empathize with their life experiences, and where they feel free to be themselves without the threat of judgment or censure. In response to the letter, some have argued that the dean willfully ignored or misunderstood these intended purposes to play up a caricature of today's college students as coddled and entitled. Safe spaces and trigger warnings pose no real threat to free speech, these critics say. That idea is just a specter conjured up by crotchety elites who fear empowered students. But as a professor of religious studies, I know firsthand how debates about trigger warnings in safe spaces can have a chilling effect on classroom discussions. It's not my free speech I'm worried about. Professors generally feel confident presenting difficult or controversial material, although some may fear for their jobs after seeing other faculty members subjected to intense and public criticism. Students, on the other hand, do not have that assurance. Their ability to speak freely in the classroom is currently endangered, but not in the way some of their peers might think. Although trigger warnings in safe spaces claim to create an environment where everyone is free to speak their minds, the spirit of tolerance and respect that inspires these policies can also stifle dialogue about controversial topics, particularly race, gender, and, in my experience, religious beliefs. Students should be free to argue their beliefs without fear of being labeled intolerant or disrespectful, whether they think certain sexual orientations are forbidden by God, life occurs at the moment of conception, or Islam is the exclusive path to salvation, and conversely, the same freedom should apply to those who believe God doesn't care about who we have sex with, abortion is a fundamental right, or Islam is based on nothing more than superstitious nonsense. As it stands, that freedom does not exist in most academic settings, except when students' opinions line up with what can be broadly understood as progressive political values. Trigger warnings in safe spaces are terms that reflect the values of the communities in which they're used. The loudest, most prominent advocates of these practices are often the people most likely to condemn Western yoga as cultural appropriation, to view arguments about the inherent danger of Islam as hate speech, or to label arguments against affirmative action as impermissible microaggressions. These advocates routinely use the word ally to describe those who support their positions on race, gender, and religion, implying that anyone who disagrees is an enemy. Understood in this broader context, trigger warnings in safe spaces are not merely about allowing traumatized students access to education. Whatever their original purpose may have been, trigger warnings are now used to mark discussions of racism, sexism, and U.S. imperialism. Logic of this more expansive use is straightforward. Any threat to one's core identity, especially if that identity is marginalized, is a potential trigger that creates an unsafe space. Trigger warnings are now used to mark discussions of racism, sexism, and U.S. imperialism. But what about situations in which students encounter this kind of discussion from fellow students? Would a University of Chicago freshman want to express an opinion that might make her someone's enemy? Would she want to be responsible for intolerant, disrespectful hate speech that creates an unsafe space? Best, instead, to remain silent. This attitude is a disaster in the religious studies classroom. As the Boston University professor Stephen Prothero put it in his book God is Not One, students are good with respectful, but they are allergic to, argument. Religion can be an immensely important part of one's identity, for many, more important than race or sexual orientation. To assert that a classmate's most deeply held beliefs are false or evil is to attack his or her identity, arguably similar to the way in which asserting that a transgender person is mistaken about their gender is an attack on their identity. Objections to anti-Muslim campus speakers as promoting hate speech and creating a hostile learning environment vividly illustrate the connection between contentious assertions about religion, trigger warnings, and safe spaces. The claim that Islam, or, by implication, any religious faith, is false or dangerous is indistinguishable from hostile hate speech.